Well, tonight we're going to be in the story of Joseph again. So if you have your Bibles, you can jump into Genesis chapter 39. We finished up chapter 37 last week, the first 17 years of Joseph's life, and we spent a little bit of time talking about the difference in culture. The culture of people who grew up where the individual was not the most important thing in the world. It was the community at large. And in order to be a part of that community, you had to put yourself second, third, or fourth, because the community always came first. And we looked at the ways in which we read this story a little bit differently than the first people that would have heard this story looked at this. We looked a little bit at the life of Joseph, of his father, of his grandfather, and how they acted differently than was culturally normal of the time, and kind of some of the ramifications and sin that caused some of the issues that Joseph was dealing with in his life. So we finished out chapter 37 of Joseph's story. He's 17. He gets in all of this trouble. His brothers sell him into slavery because at the last minute they decided not to kill him, and they sold him. And we end with Joseph being carted off to Egypt with slavers. And it's a complex story. It's kind of a depressing story when you read the first 17 years of this guy's life, because the Bible is complex. It's not it's not something that you can just read and instantly know, I should do exactly what I'm reading, because the Bible doesn't always tell you to go and do likewise. A lot of the times the things that you read are real stories where people really screwed up. But the amazing thing about Scripture is the way in which God continues to work through these people's lives. And so that's why oftentimes when you read, especially in the Old Testament, you need to be very careful not to read into it the command of God to go and do likewise, because oftentimes you're supposed to read into it, go and never do this. Do not do likewise. So, for a great example of this, you then get, in the middle of Joseph's story, chapter 38 of Genesis. If you open up your Bible to chapter 38, you will see that this is not a story about Joseph. And this is not a story that I'm going to read to you in church, because it's filthy. And it is not something I would be comfortable reading in public. It's an odd story. I highly recommend it at home, by yourself or your spouse. Please don't ever read this to your children until they are of age. It's a weird one. It goes to show, again, another example, that just because it's in Scripture doesn't mean we are supposed to act like that. It also shows us that while all people are created equally with equal intrinsic value, not all cultures are created equally. And not all aspects of every culture have the same level of value. In fact, chapter 38 of Genesis is a phenomenal example of why our culture, at least in a couple of areas, is far superior to biblical culture of the Old Testament. For instance, gentlemen, you will never have to worry, at least you should never have to worry about caring for multiple wives and multiple families at the same time. You should never have to worry about what it looks like to have 4 wives at the same time and all of these different children who are all trying to war for your inheritance. Our culture says, no, we're not comfortable with that, and I am very grateful that's not the case. Ladies, you should never have to worry about your brother-in-law having to help you create an heir for your husband. You shouldn't have to worry about that. Chapter 38 of Genesis is very concerned about this. You don't have to worry about that, thankfully. So, chapter 38, for some reason, is planted right in the middle of the story of Joseph. We see the first 17 years of his life, and then we jump in with his brother and some of the shenanigans that he gets on with, and then we're right back with Joseph, and we're going to jump into chapter 39. So if you've got your Bibles, chapter 39 is where we're going to be tonight. And here's what I want you to notice when we start chapter 39. God is with Joseph. God is with Joseph, and it is not something that you would expect to read if you were reading this story without knowing the end of the story. Because Joseph is in slavery right now. He has been sold into slavery by his family. He is jumping into a brand new culture in a brand new country with a brand new religion and probably a brand new set of foods that he's never eaten before, which may be the most difficult part of all of that. This is not the story that we would expect to hear. God is with Joseph. Because for us in our culture, at least the way that I grew up, we know that God is with us when things are going well, when things are relatively easy. There's not a whole lot of drama. You get the promotion, you get the raise, your kids are doing well in school, you're happy, you're healthy, the house is being paid for, your prayers are being answered. That's how we usually gauge if God is with us or not. But that is not the case for the story of Joseph. There is very little evidence practically that God is with Joseph at all in this section of the story. And yet for the very first time since we've read about Joseph, in the entire first 17 years of this guy's life, God is never mentioned until after Joseph is sold into slavery. It is not until his world comes crashing down that he is aware that God is actually with him for the first time. I think that's really curious. I think you're also going to find it very interesting. The thing that the original hearers of this story would have been absolutely ecstatic to see for the first time in Joseph's life is something that we read right past and you don't even notice it. It's not something you would consider to be important to the story, but for the hearers of this story for the first time, in that culture where the community is far more important than the individual, this would be an absolute beacon of transformation. And it comes in verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Now we would notice that Joseph is a slave. He is living in the home of his master. It'd be hard to tell that God was with you if that was the case. But we're told that the Lord was with Joseph, that he was succeeding in everything that he was doing. But the thing that we skip over really easily is that he was, for the first time in his life, serving his community. This brand new community that he was given, he was serving these people. He was not doing it for his own good. It was actually for the good of the Egyptians. It was for the good of Potiphar. And it seems to be very, very critical that at this point you have a character transformation in Joseph. All of these things that he had been walking through, all of this stuff that had kind of brought him from the golden boy, the favored child, the one that was going to get the inheritance even though it was not rightly his, the guy that was just living on cloud nine and kind of a jerk because of it, has been humbled to the point where he has no choice but to either crack under the pressure or to be reforged into something new. So this is where Joseph begins to serve his community instead of himself. What he does from this point out seems to be a transition point of who he is and how he's wired. So Joseph is starting at the bottom of this brand new community. He's already lost the community that he was born into. His family has betrayed him. They have sinned against him. And I don't want you to hear that all of this stuff that's happened was Joseph's fault. It really wasn't. He had a part to play. I mean, he didn't bring it on himself. There was sin all over the place. But when he jumps into this brand new community that God gives him, it's no longer just about him. But does he have a choice? Does Joseph have a choice to serve this community? Not really. Not really, because he's in a foreign country, he is a slave, and he has no rights. There is nothing that he has that he brought with him from his previous life that gives him any standing whatsoever except for the God-given skills and talents that he brings. That's it. He probably wasn't even wearing any of the clothing, not just the multicolored robe that obviously got torn off of him and sent back to his dad. He probably wasn't even wearing the sandals or anything that was his. He probably arrived in what we would consider to be burlap at this point. He brings with him nothing and he was property. From this point along in the story, Joseph is not a person, he is property. He was something to be used and placed where it would best serve his master, and that was pretty much it. And if he didn't choose that, he wouldn't have lasted very long. It was very common, well, in all areas where slavery was common, it would be common to beat him until the point where he broke. And if he didn't break and submit to his master's authority, he would have been sold off probably into hard labor or just executed and made an example of. That was just the reality that he was going to live with from that point on. But Joseph is a bright guy. And we see this throughout his story, that he's very intelligent. He has some God-given gifts that he begins to use not just for himself, as we saw in the first 17 years of his life, but he begins to use them for his community. And he realizes that he's got to change his ways. He has to figure out either I break under the yoke of this or I get transformed into something new. So, here's verse 3 through 6. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything that he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything that he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and his livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything that he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. Do you notice how different this is from the very first chapter where we meet Joseph and his community? It went from, and all of his brothers hated his stinking guts and were trying to figure out how to kill him, to thank you for serving me so well. May I give you more authority and give you more responsibility. Please take over more things. I want you around as much as possible. There is a massive shift in the way in which people see Joseph at this point. It's pretty drastic. The thing is that what Joseph did wasn't a whole lot different from those first 17 years to this point where he's in Egypt. The actual actions and the things that he was responsible for weren't a whole lot different. In fact, they were very, very similar from the jobs and the responsibilities that he had working for his dad and working for Potiphar. What was different was who Joseph was as a person. His character began to shift and to change and to be reforged into something new. And that was noticed, because what you do will be noticed, but who you are while you do it is far more important than what you will ever accomplish and what deeds you're ever actually going to do. Who you are matters 1,000 times more than what you do. Somehow, Joseph was able to take these circumstances, these situations that he got himself into, these situations that sin got him into, his own and his dad's and his brothers, all of these tragedies in this perfect storm of him getting thrown into this empty cistern, sold into slavery. He had to walk through those. He was forced to, but he wasn't forced to become the man that he became. I believe that was God's desire for him. That was the hope and the dream that God had for him, but it wasn't set in stone. Joseph had to choose how to respond to that. He had to choose whether to partner with what God was doing in his life and in the world in general, which we'll get into later in the story. But he had a choice in that. His free will gave him the ability to jump in to God's plan or to jump out of it. And Joseph chose to allow God to use these circumstances to reforge his character. But let's be honest. If we were in this situation, at least if I was in this situation, I would not be satisfied with how things were going. It sounds like quite the upgrade to go from bottom of the barrel slave to top of the pecking order slave. But the reality was Joseph was still a slave in somebody else's house. He was still in somebody else's country. He was still under somebody else's authority. And it would be very hard for, I think, any of us to be in a situation like that and still believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was with you. That you were in the middle of God's will and you were doing exactly what God was asking you to do. Because when we look at the world, we look at our situation and we read into that what God is doing. And when things aren't going well, then obviously something's wrong. Obviously God is wanting you to do something else. God's wanting something else. You've done something wrong to be in this situation. And yet for the first time we see that God is with Joseph in the middle of this garbage. You would think that Joseph's reaction would be, okay, God, I have learned my lesson. I've learned my lesson. You've helped me temper my pride. I'm no longer as self-centered as I was. I'm becoming this new person. And I am very grateful that you're blessing Potiphar. I'm very grateful that you're blessing this new community that you put me in. Thank you for all of the ways in which you're blessing Potiphar for my hard work and for my sacrifices and for my skills and for me doing what I can to follow you as best I know how. But could you maybe bless me for my sake instead of blessing Potiphar for my sake? Why don't I get any of the rewards from my hard work and my tenacity and my skill set? And why is it him? Why am I still enslaved if you're with me? Maybe a reward that you could give me would be, I don't know, freedom to not be a slave. But that is not what we see in Joseph. That's what I would see if I was in that situation. I would be very frustrated. But that's not what that's not how he reacts. He reacts by becoming an integral member of this community. For the first time in his life, he becomes not just top dog because he's been that before. Not just the guy who is favored because he's been that before. He becomes somebody who is desired. Somebody who people want him around. In fact, it might go a little bit too far because Potiphar's wife quickly begins to notice that Joseph is young and he is handsome and he is talented and he is skilled. And man, this guy, everything he touches just turns to gold, and he's not a bad looking guy. Verse 6 and 7. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. So Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come to bed with me," she demanded. And Joseph, despite doing all of the things that he knows to do, despite using his talents and his skills and all of the stuff that he brought with him from his father's household and using it for the good of this community, using it so that Potiphar's home is blessed and things are going better than they've ever gone for Potiphar, Joseph is then put in a no-win situation. There is no way that he gets out of this moment unscathed. No matter what he chooses, Joseph is going to get hosed. If he does as his master's wife requests, he is put in a spiral situation. He is going to betray his community. He's going to betray his master. He's going to even betray his master's wife, despite this being her desire, quote unquote. It is going to not go well for either of them. And when it's found out, because it is always found out, it will probably lead to his death. Because that's what you do with slaves who betray you. They are made an example of so that it never happens again. And so Joseph is looking at best case scenario, a quick execution. Worst case scenario, a very public, very painful, very long and drawn out torture and then execution. Or he gets to turn her down. And he turns down the wife of his master, who will then likely, as we will see later, make his life into a living hell. And then he'll be executed for it. Either way, Joseph is going to lose. And it's in moments like this that you get to really see somebody's character. You get to really see when somebody is put to the screws exactly who they are. Because it's not in the times when things are going well and everything's prospering and you're getting that promotion and everything starts to really blossom in your life. It's when everything comes crashing down that you get to see who you actually are. You get to watch somebody and the way in which they deal with that situation. You get to see how their character is, who they've become. And so we get to sit back and we get to watch how Joseph has changed in this situation. From the little boy that he was at 17, the favorite of his dad and the one who was going to take over everything, the one that everybody hated, we now get to see what his character has become. It's important to remember at this point that unlike the first 17 years of Joseph's life, Joseph doesn't have any fault here. Joseph could take some of the blame for that first 17 years, the way in which he had dealt with his community, his family. But in this situation, Joseph's pretty much blameless. We don't have the details of this story. We don't know if he had been purposely taking his shirt off around his master's wife, any of that kind of stuff. We don't know any of that. But what we do know shows that God had just been doing his job. He doesn't have any fault here, and yet he still gets put in this situation. And isn't that the way life usually works? There are times, no matter what you do, even when you are convinced that God is with you, that you get into a situation where there are no good options. And no matter what you do, you're going to get screwed. Somehow, even though he is a man who has not sinned in this situation, sin has affected his life. And we've all seen this happen. We've all seen good people get the short end of the stick. You've all seen the people that have worked hard, who have done really well, and yet they just can't catch that break. And it makes you wonder, especially if you've lived through those situations, what's the point? Why should I bother? Why should I go to such great lengths? Why should I work so hard? Why should I sacrifice for honor, for the glory of God? Why should I try and do all of these things when it would be so much easier to jump over there and do what everybody else is doing? But I'm over here. God, I have chosen to work hard and to try hard and to do these things you've asked me. And yet I'm in this situation, even though I've done everything that you asked. And these are the moments that forge your character. These are the moments that reveal who you are and how much you've grown in your relationship with God. The late 19th and early 20th century author, James Allen, he puts it this way: the law of harvest is to reap more than you sow. When you sow an act, you reap a habit. When you sow a habit, you reap your character. And when you sow a character, you reap your destiny. The little things that we do become our habits, and our habits become our character, and our character becomes our future. And this is where we get to see who Joseph is becoming. From the little boy who was hated by his entire family to this man who is now in a foreign country, enslaved and put in an impossible situation. Verse 8, verse 8 and 9. But Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. Nobody has more authority than I do. He's held nothing from me except for you. Because you're his wife, by the way. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. Why was Joseph so worried about God at this point? God doesn't seem to have really helped him out. If God was with him, he would be back home with his family. He'd be back home with his brothers, and the relationship would be mended, and it would look a lot more like the Brady Bunch than this dysfunctional family that we see in Genesis. And yet he stands in this moment where the community that he is in, this community that he's worked for, is now being shattered by somebody else's sin. And he's tempted. You would have to be tempted in that situation. It would be very easy to just say, well, I mean, I had no choice. She's the master's wife. What am I going to do? I'm just following orders. Verse 10 through 12. She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused. And he kept out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around when he went to do his work, and she came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come, sleep with me." And Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. He is trying desperately to do the right thing. He is trying desperately to stay away from her, put up guardrails. I'm not going to meet with you privately, any of that stuff. I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep my honor, to keep my integrity, to do what I know God is wanting for my life. And yet he still gets in trouble. Sometimes you can do everything right and the world is still going to crumble around you. And that's okay. Despite your best efforts, it might not go the way you're planning that it will go. Verse 13. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all of the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream, I ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind." She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. And then she told him her story. "That Hebrew slave you've brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me," she said. "But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak." Her sin, not his, her selfishness, her pride begins to destroy this community that Joseph is a part of, that he's been working towards, that he's actually been trying to make better by his presence. And Potiphar is now put in an impossible situation. Potiphar now has to decide, do I believe my wife, this woman that I am married to, and lose Joseph, because Joseph is going to have to be executed in this situation? Do I kill this man who has made me incredible amounts of money, who has made everything around me so much better? Everything's going smoother. We've got better crops and better animals and all the slaves. Everything's working so good. This guy has done so much for us. Do I believe my wife and keep my marriage, but lose this guy? Or do I keep this guy and lose my marriage? And at that time, he would have had to give back the bride price for this marriage, which likely was this entire estate that he was living on. And so you could keep your head slave, but lose everything else, and it would just be the two of you going off and doing your thing, I guess. Or you keep your estate, your wife. Potiphar is enraged. We don't know the history of Potiphar and his wife. We don't know if they were in love. We don't know if there was a lot of romance. I'm assuming not. It's good for us to remember that marrying for love is only a recent thing in human history. That really wasn't a thing for most of human history. You married for wealth, you married for land, you married for politics or a better position in society. Love really wasn't a thing, especially when your parents were setting up your marriage. We have no idea what the relationship between Potiphar and his wife was. But we do know what he chooses. Verse 19, Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. And so he took Joseph and publicly executed him, for Joseph was a slave, and it was Potiphar's rightful duty to do with him as he so choose. That's not what happens. He doesn't execute Joseph, of course not. That would be the end of the story, and that would be really depressing. We know that Potiphar doesn't execute Joseph. He sends him to prison, not prison, not to a labor camp. He sends him to the king's prison at the palace. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. And we're not told what happens back at the estate, but we're given some pretty solid clues that at least lead me to believe that Potiphar didn't actually believe his wife's story. It doesn't seem like Potiphar believed that Joseph tried to rape his wife, because he doesn't divorce her. He doesn't kill Joseph. You have this weird in-between thing where Joseph goes off to probably the best prison that there was available. My assumption is that Potiphar knew that Joseph was innocent. My assumption is this was not probably the first or the last time that Potiphar's wife might have done this kind of thing. I don't know that to be sure. But the punishment that Joseph receives does not fit the crime that he is accused of. So he puts him in the king's prison with all of the king's servants. And he and his wife probably continued to go on as they had, and everything was probably fine around the house. And here's how this chapter closes out. Verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph in prison. At which point Joseph was probably like, maybe don't be with me anymore. You were with me when I got sold into slavery. You're with me now that I'm in prison. Why don't you go be with my brothers for a while? This would be, for me, a very frustrating realization. God, if you are actually with me, why am I here? What is going on? I know you work in mysterious ways. I know there's this big grand plan that you're working towards, but why do I have to be a part of it? But that's not Joseph's reaction. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all of the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. If it was me, I would not want to be in favor with the warden. I wouldn't want to know the warden. I wouldn't want to be anywhere near this thing. But God was with him and showed him his favorable love. Even in the midst of this garbage. And that's why I think this story is so fascinating and so shows so much of God's character, because it shows real life. It's not this flowery rainbows and cupcakes and wine and roses type of story. It's real life, and it's garbage, and things don't work out perfectly, and it is a hard road, and yet God is with Joseph, and yet God is showing him his steadfast, faithful love, even in the midst of prison, even in the middle of slavery, even in the middle of being accused of something that he didn't do. Even when he gets punished for doing something he didn't do, God is still with him, and he's still working behind the scenes, even when Joseph doesn't understand what's going on. This was not the community that Joseph wanted to be a part of. That community should have been the family at the beginning of the story, and that didn't work out well. And the next community was going really, really well, but that didn't work out either. And so now he's placed in the middle of this new community. And for a culture that is so much more concerned about the people around them than them, this was a big deal to jump into a third community. And Joseph is no longer the young punk that he was when we see him in the first part of the story. He's no longer this arrogant, self-righteous, prideful kid who's running around with daddy's money and daddy's authority. His character has been forged through strife and frustration and unfairness and all of these trials that he's walked through. And now he is yet again at the bottom of the totem pole, and he uses the gifts and the talents and the skills that God has given him to benefit the community around him one more time. And he has allowed God over these years to temper his character and his resolve and his honor and his valor, and who he is as a man is slowly becoming the man that God designed him to be, but not through wine and roses. It is through the fires of the forge. And the crazy thing is that despite everything that's going on with this story, all of the things that go wrong, all of the sin that happens at the beginning, all the ways that Joseph screws up and gets screwed over, God is still at work. God is still doing things behind the scene, not only for Joseph's benefit, to keep him going, to keep him moving forward, because we all know you need that in life. But he's doing much, much bigger things behind the scenes that Joseph has no idea about. In fact, nobody in the world knows what's coming except for God. Joseph has this tiny little taste of what might be to come years and years ago. But he has no clue the part that he's going to play in this story that God has. And it's not only the story of Joseph's redemption. It's the story of the redemption of Joseph's entire family. It's the story of the redemption of millions of people. But that's something that we'll get into next time we're here at service.